Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. Please feel free to grab a lunch if you haven't done so already. But good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kim. I'm the coordinating curator for Native and Indigenous materials, splitting my time between the John Hay Library and the John Carter Brown Library here at Brown. And so to get started, we just wanted to thank you all for being here, for making space for this conversation in person and on Zoom, while we talk about our project Remapping Patuxet, Wampanoag Place, Memory, and the Colonial Archive. This project has been a highly collaborative one, not just between myself and my co-presenters, who are about to introduce themselves momentarily, but we've collaborated with other people who are here in the audience today. And also, it's a project that has brought people and primary materials together across the John Hay and John Carter Brown libraries, local Indigenous communities, and also the CDS. And it's been funded in part by the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. So we're bringing a lot of people together in this project. And before going any further, I also want to acknowledge the longer genealogies of Indigenous knowledge, sovereignty, and presence in this place. Brown University exists on Indigenous homelands within Narragansett territory and also within broader networks of movement, kinship, and relationship that connect Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag peoples across southern New England and the Dawnland over millennia. And I also want to briefly acknowledge the landscape image that we're opening with. It's an original artwork by Tall Oak Whedon, a Pequot, Narragansett, and Wampanoag artist, activist, and knowledge keeper born here in Providence. The Tall Oak Whedon collection was acquired by the John Hay Library in about 2023 and represents ongoing work at the library toward building collections in relation with community and calling Native and Indigenous knowledge and voice into the spaces where they've been historically underrepresented. Including contemporary Indigenous artwork and creative practice has been important to this project because we're not approaching Indigenous histories as something confined to the past. We're thinking about Indigenous presence, knowledge production, and relationships to land as ongoing and living. So that as just sort of a space of grounding for the presentation, and I'm going to hand it over to my co-panelists to introduce themselves, I think starting with Brad.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope that's not too loud. So Winikasakwami wana kwikwasinemu natasuis Brad Lopes natomas Aquinnah nope wapane wata kimwan katapatanamu manut wana nikonachik wuchi wami tayakwanish. So good day everyone. I hope the sun is shining on you at least at some point today. Hopefully it kind of peaks out. I know it was raining when I came here. My name is Brad Lopes, it's my English name, and I'm Aquinnah Wampanoag. I come from Aquinnah on Martha's Vineyard, where we've been for over 12,000 years. I'm also the education manager for our tribe, so I oversee our education department. That's what I do full-time, and then part-time, I'm the education and outreach manager for the Aquinnah Cultural Center, one of our small tribal museums down in Aquinnah. So it's a gift to be a part of this project and to work with everyone here on this panel and everyone involved in this project.
Hi, I'm Christine DeLucia. I'm also very honored to be part of this. I am in the history department at Williams College, which is located in the homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee community, and I am grateful for the opportunity to learn with the community and support their work of sovereignty today. The classes that I teach at Williams are early American history and Native and Indigenous studies focused. I am a non-Indigenous scholar, and that shapes how I come to this work as well, and the kind of learning that I do with communities and nations and the collaborators here.
Hi, I'm LaForge. I'm currently a postdoc in American Material Culture at Boston University, but I came to this project because I was a PhD candidate and got my PhD at Brown in American Studies last year. So we'll give a genealogy of this project in just a little bit, but it began in 2019 when I was just starting my PhD. Like Christine, I'm a non-Native scholar, so I come to this project through a commitment to reciprocity and relationship building with Native American and Indigenous studies within the methods of Native American and Indigenous studies and with and across Native tribal nations and communities. And my research and my broader work is on histories of material culture, diplomacy, and place-based activism and the role of Native women's leadership in the 19th and 20th century Northeast. And through that, I've built reciprocal projects with several tribal nations and Indigenous-led institutions. Yeah, grateful to be here.
Thanks, everybody. So the four of us constitute what has been sort of a working group we'll get into and talk about, but I also want to acknowledge the other member of our working group, Kim Nusko, who works at the JCB, who's here also supporting, and also just a shout out to other folks that we've engaged with around the sort of journey of this project, including Pat Rubertone and Max Scott, who are faculty here at Brown, but also Bertie Mandelblatt has talked with us about this project, a curator at the JCB. And we've also spoken to community knowledge keepers, Linda Coombs and Elizabeth James Perry, who are both Aquinnah Wampanoag. So just want to acknowledge them and call them into this space. We also have included a QR code that you all are welcome to engage with in order to facilitate feedback about the project or thoughts and ideas that you might want to share with us after hearing about. Because I started by saying how collaborative in nature this project is, and that's like extends very broadly in terms of being in conversation with people about the work.
And we'll show the QR code at the end as well, so don't worry about snapping it this instant.
And I'm going to hand around some analog note cards, and we would welcome very, very genuinely any comments, questions, critiques, feedback. If you would like to be in further touch with us, please feel welcome to write on this and just get it back to us before you leave today. So, thanks.
All right. So as you know, the project is titled Remapping Patuxet. But again, one thing we sort of emphasize internally is that much of the work actually happens before writing what is a story map or the story map itself. And I'll talk a little bit about story maps in a minute. A major part of the process has been slowing down and asking difficult questions about what it means to create a digital humanities project about Indigenous homelands within a colonial institution, and how to avoid simply reproducing the same extractive dynamics under the language of inclusion or accessibility. So while we'll show parts of the story map later, a lot of this presentation is really about process, the conversations, the tensions, limitations, and ethical considerations shaping the work. So for those unfamiliar, a story map is a digital storytelling platform created through another software called ArcGIS. The software combines maps, images, archival materials, and narrative text into a very interactive format. We chose story maps partly because digital platforms can create broader public access to materials that would otherwise remain inaccessible within special collections or academic spaces. At the same time, we're very aware that story maps is not a neutral platform. It's proprietary software housed within institutional infrastructures and built upon GIS systems rooted in Western cartographic assumptions about land boundaries, scale, and legibility. So part of this project has involved asking, what does it mean to work within a platform whose underlying logic is already shaped by colonial forms of map making? What possibilities exist within that, and where are the limitations? The project thinks specifically about the place of Patuxet, more commonly known today by the name given to it by English settlers, Plymouth, Massachusetts, and uses Samuel de Champlain's early 17th century map of Port St. Louis to engage with the archive around issues of placemaking and cartography. Though we envision the sort of future inclusion of other Indigenous homelands and colonial mapping histories across the region, including Narragansett homelands and maps connected to Verrazano's voyages and encounters on the Narragansett coastline, for example. And so we've also made a conscious decision not to like decenter Champlain in the map and in the project. So while you will see an image of Champlain's map in the future, we're not starting from there. And so also the genealogy of the project itself is really important. As Ally mentioned, the initial iteration of the project began like 2019 through Christine and Ally and Pat Rubertone's research into Champlain's voyages and other maps and related materials held at the John Carter Brown Library. The work included, you had a public-facing sort of open house, and a story map intended to make materials more accessible and to also recontextualize them sort of in an indigenizing spirit. In about 2020, however, the project kind of lacked a secure home and was unexpectedly deleted from the internet.
With no possibility for restoration.
Yeah. There was no long-term infrastructure or preservation plan in place, and so, as Ellie said, the work kind of became unrecoverable in a lot of ways. That loss became important in our thinking as sort of we've developed our talks through this working group because it revealed how precarious digital humanities work can be, especially projects connected to Indigenous histories that are often celebrated but face challenges when it comes to materially sustaining them at an institutional level. In 2023, after I was hired as coordinating curator for Native and Indigenous materials, conversations around revisiting the project began again, sort of like reviving. In 2025, Brad entered the project and pushed us to think more critically about what indigenizing actually means in practice. Brad's questions fundamentally shifted the direction of the work away from simply contextualizing Champlain's map and towards centering Wampanoag knowledge systems, relationships to place, and Indigenous forms of placemaking. So the project increasingly became less about the map itself and more about the conditions under which the maps are produced. Champlain's map is often framed as a record of discovery or first encounter, but we approach it instead as a product of knowledge extraction. Wampanoag knowledge of waterways, coastlines, travel routes, cultivation practices, and kinship networks made maps like his possible. Yet the map simultaneously works to flatten and obscure those relationships by translating lived Indigenous worlds into forms legible to European empire. And importantly, we don't see this as something isolated to the 17th century, right? The same cartographic logics, I think, in terms of fixing land, bounding territory, or transforming relationships into property, continue across later colonial mapping practices, including through land allotment and settler land surveys. And those dynamics, I think, also continue within archives and collecting processes at institutions like libraries. Libraries and museums often hold materials produced through colonial extraction, which simultaneously separates Indigenous knowledge from the communities and relationships that gave rise to it. So part of the project involves critically examining not only the map or other maps that we pull in, but also the institutional structures through which the map has been preserved, cataloged, interpreted, and circulated. So that's from like a 1,000-foot perspective, kind of what remapping Patuxet means for this project.
You know, I think when we approach this project too as well, for me, it's how do we center always our traditional knowledge keeping practices and the ways in which we understand land, water, and space around us, right, as Wampanoag people. And, I think about this a lot when we're talking about cartography, because I think trying to situate and understand our world within Western cartography models is always a losing battle. It's something that you're never going to really get out from it what, I really want to get out of it. And as I was thinking about today's talk and just our conversations we've been having, I kind of keep coming back to one map I know of that's at MHS's collection. And it's from Connecticut. It's from Sachems in Connecticut. And when they're mapping out this particular area of the land on this particular document, it's actually showing you more or less relationality rather than this space in terms of empire building, extraction, and conquest, right? And so you're actually seeing south as the northern top of the paper or the top part of the paper. So again, even the orientation is different from what you might understand in a Western cartography setting. And it's really looking at those different riverways and then the different kind of areas that everyone's calling home around the different riverways, right? And I think about how our ancestors understand that space and place that we're really talking about, Patuxet, right? And so as we kept kind of coming back to what does it mean to really center Wampanoag knowledge? Well, oftentimes it comes back to a couple different words. It comes back to communal, knowledge is communal within our communities. Something that I know is the, quote unquote, property of all Wampanoag people. And I treat everything I do that way. I don't care if it's for a book that's going to be published. I share it with everyone in the tribal community. Like, that's how we are, and that's how we're always going to continue to be in terms of knowledge keeping practices. It's centered around community and that communal kind of protocols and practices in terms of transferring that knowledge onto others and sharing that knowledge too. And again, when we think about like Champlain himself in that time period, Champlain is very much so an agent of empire. I mean, all of these individuals are agents of empire. And that map then becomes a tool, a further tool of empire building and extraction, right? To think of Master Wampanoag Elder Gisan Toney, who very influential to me. He always uses the framing of from the boat versus from the land. And Champlain's map is very much so from the boat. I mean, quite literally from the boat. And so it's taking that perspective in terms of almost surveying what can we extract from this particular place, right? Versus a Wampanoag understanding of that is going to look a lot different. It's going to center that place and that relationality with all beings within that space. And so I kept thinking about the things on that map that are really not there, the things that are not being shown because they're not really important, or the things that also would have been occurring around that time period anyways, based on when he arrives. I think of things like fire breaks for prescribed burning and other things like that. Just based on some of the comments made, that's obviously occurring, and we know that from our own oral traditions. So in my head, I was picturing a project of how do we almost completely unravel the map and show those layers of it, the layers that are completely, utterly missing from this, the layers that were kind of had no value to somebody like Champlain or to another European colonizer that was coming for essentially extractive means. Right? Those are things that are truly important to the community, but they were not there or depicted on those things very often. So I think about that stuff a lot. I also think about how we understand those critical relationships that are occurring in this kind of space that are not really shown there, right? I'm thinking about that relation right now. For me, a big one is with whales, right? This is a time period where we're a couple weeks ahead, but that's when the whales are moving through our waters, right? And that's critically important for us as Wampanoag people. I was just out on the tip of Cape Cod with some Mashpee kids the other day, and we did see a right whale spout kind of coming right around the tip. And we were just so happy to kind of see that. And that very practice, right, is occurring while this kind of map is happening, right? These things are all absent from this picture, but they're clearly there, and they're clearly evident, especially if you're looking at this as a Wampanoag person. But also you're centering things like oral traditions, your written sources that are oftentimes informing things like Champlain's map or later iterations that will then use Champlain's map as kind of a base or one of the base sources. These are oftentimes like the key factor informing how those narratives are crafted, right? And I think for Wampanoag knowledge systems, that's not really something that's informing a lot of what we understand and know about the past. We're talking about these oral traditions. We're talking about language keeping practices. Because even if you understand the Wampanoag language in terms of places and place names, that's actually like almost a GPS for understanding the land, right? My favorite spot in the whole world is on Martha's Vineyard, southwest end of the island, called Sukunket, the place of skunks. Okay. And I love that spot because, fun fact, they still go there. Usually in February, March, there's a lot of skunks down there because that's when they make new skunks. And so they're kind of busy down there doing their thing. But again, we know, right, that's the place of skunks. That's one of the ways you're going to navigate these places and spaces. And also this intergenerational knowledge, right? The second that Kim reached out about this project, I was like, this doesn't happen without Linda Coombs, because everything I know, everything a lot of us know has been informed directly by Linda and others that are older than us. And also when there are opportunities to involve youth in this project, that should happen too as well, because that intergenerational pedagogy is very much so a critical component of our learning systems and really always have been and never has gone away. But again, I think one of our biggest goals here was really just to expose the limits of really what Champlain's map offers. It's a very limited understanding of this situation, of the scenario in which he is kind of trying to relay. And that limitation, though, is also something that is intentional in some ways. It's that intentional form of, I need to communicate to basically individuals in Europe who are investing money in this, that this is worth this investment. I come back to that word investment because I can't emphasize enough how much of this is tied directly to money and people investing significant money in colonization of other people's homelands without consent.
Thank you, Brad, for this. And to pick up on this thread of extraction and also what was it that Champlain was doing and the influence that he has had, a couple of remarks on this. This map has been used and continues to be used in a lot of places. You may have seen this before in museum exhibitions, in textbooks, if you've taken certain history classes. It gets reproduced, often without much critical context for why it was created, by whom, and as Brad was saying, from what particular perspective, that this is an early 17th century French mariner and someone trained in military roles who is then coming to Turtle Island, North America, and spending over the course of many voyages a lot of time up and down the Atlantic coast, as well as moving in towards the indigenous interior and the Great Lakes towards that direction. I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of writing and scholarship about this work, including in Canadian context and some in US context as well. And I am still in a very much learning mode, and I thank Bertie Mandelblatt for beginning to point us in some important directions. But on the topic of extraction, how can we look at this map and understand that a little bit more fully? A couple places I wanted to evoke here. One is through work that Linda Coombs has shared out. So Linda Coombs, as a Wampanoag historian, culture keeper, knowledge keeper, and she has really emphasized the importance of not starting accounts of even European arrivals in the Dawnland in 1620 when the Pilgrims come. Instead, looking much earlier to seasonal fishing that is happening across the Atlantic coast, to fur trading that is occurring, and also to actions like this. This map is produced 15 years before, or from a voyage 15 years before the Pilgrims come, right? And so that long prehistory, which is also introducing disease and is a site of encounter, often very violent, between French colonizers who at times are going on shore armed and exerting violence against native people while also seeking information about both the coast and the interior. This is a very brief summation, but that is some of what is occurring in the context of producing this map. I was recently rereading the text that surrounds this because it's important to know this map was not produced in isolation. It was part of a book, and the original is in French, and I was reading it in English translation, but we'll go back to the French. And among the things that really jump out when you read the text is how much Champlain is seeking out native people for information about what the land, water, and resources, including plants and animals, are like. This is not an academic set of questions. He is assessing the prospects for colonization here, for trading, for fishing, for agriculture, right? So all of this is very instrumental. It's also very clear to me as he's coming through Wampanoag homelands how immediate the violence is. And that is a section of the text where there's sometimes called a skirmish, but we need to think about the power dynamics of French people coming off the ship armed and going after native people. The other couple things I wanted to highlight here have to do with different types of value. Because in our conversations, there are multiple forms of value, and money is only one of those, right? I was interested to see that different printings of Champlain's work continue to be auctioned, right, and purchased by libraries, rare books collections, sometimes private individuals. One first edition 2 years ago from 1613 sold at Christie's for $1.3 million. That is a high-end valuation, but other versions of this have sold for six figures and other amounts right in that vicinity. I am not an expert in the book market, so I defer to others who might have context, but I think that gives us a glimpse into some of the financial ways that this map continues to move, and that academic collecting institutions and their acquisition budgets are also part of that. And maybe as a last note here, I don't think we still have the slide of the Americana entry that we are sharing.
No.
Okay, so I'll say,
We have a link to it. We'll show it.
okay. There are various kinds of erasures that are happening in addition to the ones Brad was highlighting. And presently, the digital interface called Americana that the John Carter Brown Library has developed, which takes an enormous amount of work to develop something like that, does not indicate the indigenous contexts, really, that this is based on. It says Indians of North America. That's a common subject heading. And the metadata or cataloging information is an important site that we would welcome conversation and action about so that these forms of invisibility don't continue to replicate. It means that if you come to search Americana and you put in Wampanoag, it is not going to bring this up yet. But there's a lot of potential to revisit that.
Yeah, and thank you, Christine, for that. And to pick up on actually the piece about the subject headings and Library of Congress and the metadata, we also wanted to signal two things. One, that this project is already in conversation with other indigenizing and indigenous digital humanities projects that I'll return to, but also that there are, thanks to Kim Nusko for sharing some of this, existing protocols and principles for archival repatriation and return. So through this project and the critique of conquest alongside the centering of Wampanoag knowledge, it's also important to frame practices of archival collecting as part of the ongoing extraction process. And that the Society of American Archivists in August 2025 published 5 principles to center repatriation and ethical returns that archivists and archives can take up. And so this is in part a call for archives to be thinking with these protocols for archival repatriation, because while the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 was revised in 2024 to actually, for the first time in its legislative history, prioritize indigenous knowledge and decision-making, which is an interesting choice to make after over 30 years of the law being in place, to only then realize that indigenous knowledge should be part of the process and prioritized. But that there are protocols and principles for archives and repatriation and return, and that the theft and extraction of indigenous knowledge through the production of these types of maps and documents does not exist in a vacuum and does not operate in a collection today without holding some of these histories of conquest and enacting them in the present. And in addition to that, we wanted to highlight 2 projects that Kim and I and others, but we've been really thinking with, because this project is also asking, what does it mean to build indigenous digital humanities? What does it mean to do indigenizing digital humanities, as Brad has put it? And what does it mean to actually critique these colonial archiving practices while also centering indigenous knowledge in the process? So I just wanted to highlight 2 of these projects, and we're actually presenting with members of these projects at the upcoming Native American and Indigenous Studies Conference this summer in Chile. So the first one is the Ojibwe Mosinagan Digital Edition project, which is run by Kelly Weiskup at Northwestern with a wide team of great people. And this is work to create a collaborative digital edition of the Mosinagan, or Literary Voyager, which was written by Jane Johnston Schoolcraft and her family. So it's really decentering Henry Rose Schoolcraft and emphasizing Ojibwe language work and the work of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft through this digital edition. And the second project is the remapping the Oceti-Secoa-Noyate orature as deep mapping. This is run by Samantha Major, Christopher Paxa, and Kaylin James. And this is really thinking about recording Oceti-Secoan's community members' knowledge, orature about places of historical, cultural, or political importance, but also creating an actual resource. So thinking about the audience, who this is shared with. Is it just academic? Their answer is vehemently no. It's a resource for Lakota and Dakota language learning, knowledge sharing, and community building that also is thinking with, as Kaylin James puts it, the right to decay, the idea that the digital realm is not permanent and that this resource exists within Lakota frameworks of the right to decay.
So now we're going to try to show you a little bit of what the story map is looking like, and then we'll walk through what Christine nodded to in terms of how the map exists in space on the Americana platform. I think I have to get up. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how someone might encounter the map if you're a researcher at the JCB or not at the JCB but remotely accessing the JCB's collection. You see this page from the larger volume of Champlain's Voyages captured here in the Americana platform. So here's an image of the map or that page in the book. And also, as Christine had mentioned, sort of the metadata and description associated with it. And so one thing that is interesting for this project, of course, is the role of metadata and cataloging language in shaping interpretation. A lot of the descriptive language currently attached to the object relies on inherited Library of Congress terminology. Like here you see, I don't know if I can point to it, but Indians of North America. And so one sort of thing, as Christine mentioned, that's missing from this record is the word Wampanoag at all. So the terminology is often overly generalized, inaccurate, or actively flattening. Indigenous peoples become categorized under broad terms like this Indians of North America, while Wampanoag specific histories and relationships to place become largely invisible.
You're also like, I just noticed too, I feel like you're kind of being kind with the word exploration there. It just reminds me of like a lot of fifth grade curriculum where it's like European exploration.
So we've thought about how someone might encounter the map and what the frame is for the map in places, in spaces like Americana or library catalogs generally. So part of our choosing of story maps was actually wanting a more dynamic space for redescription and recontextualization. I'm going to try to get back to the Zoom. How do I do that? I'm not used to using that. So we chose story maps not because story maps solves all of these problems. It really does not, but because it allows us slightly more room to foreground layered interpretation, Indigenous place-based knowledge, and critique of the archive and even story maps itself. All right, so it's, as you know and have learned, it's all a work in progress. So this is sort of the draft version. It's not publicly available yet. We're still working. So much of this is process and not product yet, but just to give you a feel of what we're thinking about. So obviously a lot of context about what we're doing and what it means. Using, again, and centering art made by Wampanoag and other Southern New England Native folks to talk about and think about land and space and place, right? So again, the platform is I guess it's sort of entry level, which works for us. It's maybe not the ideal platform, as I mentioned, and we'll talk about in a moment. But we liked everything's so big, the dynamism of being able to sort of work in this space and use maps. I'll also mention too, in terms of how we're mapping and thinking about that in ArcGIS, it's been especially frustrating for me to be able to find like a base layer map that does away with like imposed borders or that doesn't have this like 21st century, the roads and the buildings and the things. Like I just want a topographical map that I can't find a good one that isn't showing like, I don't know, watersheds or like all these things.
Plymouth Rock.
Or Plymouth Rock, yeah. But we've been sort of mapping different locations and weaving together art, contemporary photographs, thought about place and place names with sort of engagements with the 1605 map itself. I want to point out, again, in draft form, so I'll change how we're able to view this image, but also have been working, as I said, with Wampanoag artists like Elizabeth James Perry, for example, who has created several versions of this decolonized bear map, which sort of superimposes the southern New England coastline on top of a bear relative and is using Indigenous toponyms to sort of remap or reclaim places and place names. So really important to sort of put her map and her thinking in conversation with the rest of this. The platform, as I said, assumes a particular kind of storytelling, visually hierarchical, heavily dependent on GIS. I mentioned sort of the tension around like how do we even find. When we're zoomed out this far, I like this map, but when we zoom in and are thinking about place, I like it less and less. So just a couple other places that we're mapping. And thinking to like pushing into the contemporary context, thinking about how Wampanoag and other people of the Dawnlands are thinking about placemaking and memory making and community. So even thinking about contemporary reclamation of place, but also ceremony and memory. I'm thinking about the National Day of Mourning, which takes place in Plymouth. On every National Day of Mourning Day, but you could also call that Thanksgiving Day. I think we're constantly thinking about how to work within the platform, but also against it. How do we map place-based interference while also emphasizing that Indigenous placemaking is not reducible to like these Western cartography methods? How do we create movement across themes, relationships, kinship networks, memory, and embody relationship to land rather than sort of reinforcing static territorial understandings? How do we foreground that this project is ongoing, unfinished, relational, and accountable rather than sort of presenting a single authoritative narrative? And so those are sort of maybe an entry point into all of the tensions that we're holding, which lead us, if I can successfully make it back to the PowerPoint, into the next slide.
I think we could all speak to this.
I think we kind of all have thoughts about opportunities for growth and archival futures. So I think we're landing on a slide where any of us can sort of take it up. But please, Brad.
I think I'll speak a lot to like my personal experience. I choose not to work in academia other than in these kinds of settings, mostly as like an independent contractor of sorts, mostly because I do not know what is really possible here. I think that there are certain bounds of what is really possible within academia, within Western institutions, because in truth, I don't think Western institutions are actually ready to decolonize. And so I think a lot of this for me has landed actually within the realm of indigenization within a Western institution or a Western system, which I think oftentimes gets confused for decolonization. But they are two critically different things. Oftentimes one is actually about, quite literally taking down a structure or a system, whereas one is existing within that system and structure. And it might change it slightly, but rarely does it actually change the bones of the structure, I guess you could call it. And so, I've done a fellowship here at Brown as well as the JCB Indigenous Archives Fellowship. I don't know if that's the official name.
Sounds good.
And I did it because there are papers from our home, from some people that are distant ancestors to my family here in the Holosy collection. And the Holosy family was very important in our community. And they are a key reason why we are still in Aquinnah, even though we are, hanging on in many ways. And I felt a need to sit with that because to me, they're not papers, they're not words, they're memories and stories. And part of that family is there in that paper. And so it was important for me to sit there and be there. And just to be able to sit with those ancestors in many ways. A lot of his writing is in Wampanoag, so to see a list of folks being married in the community written in Wampanoag was very heartwarming in a lot of ways, very moving. And I hated that I had to come here to see it. I hated that I had to get on a boat, coordinate that, which is, by the way, is always like $200 or something most of the time. get over here and, really coordinate everything else about my life just to access that. When those papers were written, literally probably less than 5 minutes away from where I was, like at the time, right? Just written down the road, probably at the Baptist church area, which is only literally 3 minutes from where I work. So that was a challenge, and I think also replicates a lot of what we see with the imposition of like colonial authority and aggression, because by at least the 1650s, more often than not, you are being summoned to Taunton or Boston. They're not coming to you. You're coming to them. And unfortunately, I see that replicated in a lot of Western systems. If I want to work with an organization, I usually have to come to that organization as opposed to come to Aquinnah, which is much more aligned with our protocols too, as well, is to come and visit our home and actually, be grounded and situated there. I think about that too as well, but there's other things that are here that are from the island, including John Cotton Jr.'s diary, which he wrote entirely trying to learn our language. And so that's actually been a key memory piece of sorts that's actually informed the language reclamation project. But it's, again, here. So I think there are limits. I think that, Kim has in the first bullet point too, archives are not neutral. They're very clearly intentional in what they're doing. And they also have a ability to determine what has authority, what has power, and what doesn't, right? What is worth archiving and what is not worth archiving. I run into this a lot with our oral history work, is that a lot of people perceive that as not worth archiving in some settings. But it's extremely profound when I'm able to pop in a VHS tape and hear my great-grandfather for the first time, right? Or see him for the first time, which, also involved finding a VHS player. But we're all set there. So any future ones, I'm all good. But, I think, again, I think there's a lot of opportunities for growth within Western institutions. I think that the thing that really has to be contemplated is how much are we willing to risk or change about this structure itself, right? And what are the bounds in which that occurs? Is there a certain point where, you reach and it's okay, or do you fully disassemble the whole thing? And then even then, what does it really look like, right? Are we more in that Greek philosophy problem about the ship, right? I don't really know if they can decolonize. I think about this in museum settings because I remember being a part of one conversation and that question had been asked, what does a decolonized museum look like? And somebody had said, well, it wouldn't exist. And I was like, yeah, probably not in the way that we understand it or know it or think of it. Just like I think a lot of Western educational institutions would not exist the way that we think and know about them today. Knowing that our history of education, it would look a lot different if it aligned more with that kind of history and that pedagogy, that approach. So when I do think about this project too as well, I think about how I've had a really hard time situating it within the digital StoryMap platform, because that's not what I would do if I really had all of the ability in the world to do it, right? We would be on the land, we would actually be probably doing this in person, walking this space and place and actually interacting with it, being there together and actually engaging in that storytelling that occurs, that intergenerational interaction that occurs, that place-space setting that occurs. That to me is the core of how I would represent this. And if I had to put it on something physically, it probably would not be done this way. I keep coming back to birch bark because there's a long tradition of birch bark maps. Of course, they don't look the same. They're oftentimes more relational in terms of pointing you how do these 2 points relate to one another. I think about things like that too as well. I think there's a lot of opportunity to understand cartography from Indigenous perspectives, including through projects like this. So, I think oftentimes, we're navigating and exploring the boundaries of what is possible when we're doing a lot of this work. And a lot of that, right, is new space. And new space is oh, we don't really know what's going on here. And we're kind of figuring it out along the way, which I think is a really, can be a really powerful thing to do as well. I think lastly, too, I think about ownership, because oftentimes, right, A lot of Western knowledge-keeping systems, I think, place a lot of individual emphasis on ownership of ideas and knowledge. That's where we get things like copyrights and trademark laws and those kinds of practices that you see legally. And I think about where would an idea that pertains to Wampanoag knowledge and knowledge-keeping practices live? Well, primarily, I think of all intellectual property, if we're going to call it that, as being the intellectual property of the Wampanoag Nation and the Wampanoag people, first and foremost. That's true of our language. It's true of anything we do. And I don't always know if that same kind of practice is embodied within Western institutions as well. That something that we create here, would all Wampanoag people have open access to that, right? That to me is important. Is really how we understand and own those things. I think there's been tribes who have had critically important, sometimes sacred knowledge be claimed by other people and then put under trademarks or other kind of copyright laws and taken from them. And that's just not okay in any way, shape, or form. So I do think it's possible. I do think that we can move forward in a good way, but I think it's going to require us to really do a quick check on like the power dynamics at play here. And the fact that, again, this very institution sits on Narragansett homelands, but from what I understand and what I hear from, the grapevine, not a great relationship with the Narragansett Nation overall. And so I would say that is a little telling to me, as well as being, a Wampanoag person. And so I think that that's also something to think about from an institutional standpoint, besides another issue that I have with Brown institution as an institution.
Thanks so much for that, Brad. And I also wanted to point to an opportunity for growth, but also a challenge in relationship to that point about decolonization versus indigenization, which is to say that what would active support for this project look like, and what would institutional support for this project look like? One of the reasons why this project was deleted in 2020 was because it was under a course that I took as a student, and Brown decided to delete that course entirely. So there was total institutional control over all of that content. Brown owns the content that we produce. There are contracts that had been signed, but there are also other ways of governing data, such as memorandums of understanding, which can speak to these relationships of knowledge, but are ultimately not necessarily legal contracts. But then also this project also asks, what does institutional support for research look like? Does research exist to support tenure and promotion or institutional accreditation? I think we would all say no, that's not the purpose of these building these relationships. But then where do projects like this live? And where are they supported? And how can institutions actually engage in reciprocity and knowledge sharing and support for projects that are not necessarily coming from faculty who are pursuing tenure or grants that have significant institutional value for a place like Brown. And so that's something we're grappling with. And I think ideally maybe this would not live at Brown necessarily. I would love for it to maybe live somewhere else, but within this grappling, we just question what that would look like. And so, and thank you so much for framing all of that, Brad.
I'll just say briefly, so we can have time for conversation too. Kim's leadership and Brad's for pushing into really essential, foundational, and often difficult dimensions of power, of relationships, of intellectual and other authority, that those can't be talked around. And in fact, that is at the heart of this very slow process. In some fashion, I am grateful this got deleted because it has created an opportunity to approach from other points of view, and it will take the time that it needs, and it will go where it needs. And it has not been easy in the work that you are doing to make this supported.
Thank you. That's it from us. I think we have like 7 minutes for questions if people have them. Sure, Kiku.
I have a question, I think for Brad, but maybe you too, Allie, about you were talking about making sure that whatever the project is open access to the people who it's about. But I'm also wondering about like some kinds of knowledge that shouldn't be open to anyone but you, and if like how you deal with decisions about including that in the project or not, and if there's like ways to include it and then restrict access to just the tribe.
That's a good question. I think we've had like some initial conversations around it. And I do think we all have a shared understanding that there's just some things that should not be included because that's more closed community knowledge. I think that sometimes, in my encounters with folks, that can be something that's pushed back on. Because I don't know how often, especially Americans who are more within like the mainstream American kind of culture, I guess I would call it, are used to being in a situation where they don't have access to somebody else's like identity or something about them. And this came up recently when somebody was upset that NAGPRA existed because they weren't able to access things to better understand us as Indigenous people. And I was sitting there like right there. I was like, I'm right here, I'm alive. Like you could talk to me too. That's a great way of understanding us too. Just gonna throw that out there. But I do know of some softwares or some platforms or just practices in general that are also able to show like certain people some content and others not. I think of like, are they still around? But Makutu or yeah. Like that's one platform that does something like that. And so you're able to have like more closed community knowledge that's really only accessible through like a certain portal or certain platform. My question there is always about who owns that data in terms of like the company or the group, because it's very possible that your data or whatever it is could also end up like exposed to like an OpenAI model or something like that. And so that's why I always tell our kids, like, don't speak our language into any of the AI models or anything yet until I know what it's about.
I have way too many questions, but I'm going to try and keep it brief. So number one, is there any way that you could access just a different map in general or build your own? Would that cost money? What would that look like?
Do I need it? Okay. So building your own map instead of utilizing someone else's, or even what about connecting with the decolonial map organization?
Atlas, Decolonial Atlas.
The Decolonial Atlas. I know like there's some things that are problematic with that, but even just like thinking beyond what, settlers view as a map, what that looks like. And there's an article that I read that I show my students and have like a thing in my course about it, but it's called The Drum as a Map, and it looks at Sami map making. So obviously not on this continent, but this challenging of colonial perspectives where, a map can be something that is not just for geographical placement, but also something that's sacred, it's relational, and it's beyond, I guess, the physical realm as well, because music is something that you can't necessarily touch. I'll leave it there.
I've thought a lot about carving something as well. Like honestly, I think of that too, just because of our creation story coming from a certain tree. I think about doing something from that particular wood. But I think you make a really good point about like the nature of that knowledge does not always need to be like a physical manifestation as well, like in terms of how we think about a map. And I think again back to that whole like physical map experience that I was kind of describing earlier of like us being on the land and actually engaged in that process of understanding this space and being with that space. But knowing us, that would probably involve dancing at some point, which is always good. But again, that's another way of understanding and being in relation with that space. But it's also understanding like the kinship, I think, that extends across that space. Not understanding it in terms of maybe way that we think of like political boundaries today necessarily. But I think of like the Catawba map, for example, which is very clearly kinship ties, drawing all the different ties between families and whatnot. And, I think that that's also a way to understand space and just a way that we understand the world around us. I think we're oftentimes bound to very strict narratives sometimes in like Western cartography. But I think there's an opportunity here to even do this through things like song, right? Like, what would it mean to have a song that described like moving around Nope, like the island itself, right? And then how could that song then be used with our youth to understand, like, okay, if you go around here, you're gonna hit your boat, okay, and it's not gonna be fun,
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. And the first thing I want to say is thank you so much. This was a really wonderful, wonderful panel. And I just, from my perspective as a curator of historical maps, I think, like, all I can say is this is awesome. Like, and the more work you can do, and it sounds like you've already gone a long ways on this road, but to kind of de-reify this Champlain map, I think the better it will be, and picking up a little bit on the last comment as well. And in fact, some of the comments that you mentioned earlier, this idea that everything should begin with this one little map in this one book, in this 1 year, which isn't even the right year. I think, like, absolutely, you spoke about somebody who said, you should be looking at accounts of seasonal fishing, like go back into the much, much earlier, into the 16th century. If you're interested in some kind of comparison or taking into account the mismapping of Indigenous homelands by Europeans, even that history is much, much older. And I think, shifting the attention away from Champlain as a person and this map as a singular object is fantastic. And I think, when we met earlier, I mentioned that even Champlain and his mapping, it's so wrong to think of it as iconic. It is iconic, but that's unfortunate, and that's its own process, right? Like, in its own context, he was somebody who had a fair bit of power and a fair bit of visibility, but he had certain skills. He was doing certain things. The form itself was in flux when he was doing it, when he was engaged in map making. And I think breaking apart this sense that it's this absolutely this airtight structure is the most you can do. And just, there is so much fascinating material on Indigenous mapping, on critiques of mapping. Critical historical cartography as a field has been growing since the 1980s, and a ton of people are writing about mapping as power, mapping, deconstructing maps, and especially the idea of mapping and indigeneity, and I'd say in the last, is one of the most vibrant areas of scholarly work around cartography and historical cartography. So there's a ton out there. There's absolutely a ton out there. So I'm willing to help more when I can. It's not really a question so much as a comment and an offer, but thank you again. This was really great.
We kind of keep coming back to like starting places, and as we're commenting about that too, like, in my head too, if I had to pick, this is a biased one, by the way. I know somebody from Mashpee would tell me that. But if I had to pick a starting point, it would be Masha making the islands, wading out to the coastline, and everything would still be together. And then the slow process of making the vineyard, making Nantucket, the Elizabeth Islands. And then eventually we'll get up to Champlain, maybe. Eventually.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.